There we go. My phone did not want to connect to the Bean page, but we have made it. So, welcome to Life Science Live for this lovely Friday morning. Hopefully you all have had a great week. And today we're going to kind of have a little continuation of our conversation from last week. So, last week we talked about penguins, which are animals that live down in the Antarctic and in the southern hemisphere. We learned that not all of them live in Antarctica. But today we're going to talk a little bit about animals that live in the northern pole, the North Pole, the northern hemisphere, but the cold part. So the Antarctic, or Antarctica itself, I should say, is a landmass. It's covered by ice, but there's land underneath that ice. And so if the ice were to all melt down there, there would still be land for those penguins to live on, even though it wouldn't be nearly as cold. But the Arctic is not a landmass. There's no just plain Arctica up there. Instead, there's just sea ice that covers the northern polar cap of the Earth. And so the North Pole itself has no land underneath. If that ice were to melt, it would just be ocean on top of the world. So the animals that live up there, if they're ever spending time up there, they're just on straight sea ice. And so we're going to talk about some of those animals that live at the North Pole and around the North Pole, and talk about how they survive. So, we mentioned that penguins don't live up there, but there was once an animal that was very, very similar to the South Pole penguins. And this bird was called the great auk. And it's kind of like the northern hemisphere version of a penguin. It's extinct now, but it was closely related, I should say not closely related to penguins, but it looked a lot like a penguin. So it was in a completely different family, but it had the same sort of flippers, it had waterproof feathers, it swam in the water, and it ate fish. I'm going to show you a picture of what those guys looked like. Let's see. There we go. So this, if it'll load, is a great auk, a couple of great auks. So you can see they had the same coloration, they had those tiny little wings that were better for swimming than for flying, and they had big beaks for catching fish, and waterproof feathers, and probably lots of fat to help them survive in the cold water up in the Arctic. And so all of these features that make them look like penguins are part of a process that we call convergent evolution. So that means that we have two animals that are not related to each other, but they happen to live in sort of similar circumstances. And so their environment causes them, over time, to develop traits that look really similar to each other. This guy looks a lot like a penguin, even though he's not related to penguins. In about the mid-1700s, people were obsessed with the great auk. Their feathers were really useful for a lot of things, and so and they were really easy to catch. They were clumsy on land, just like our penguins that we have today. And so sailors would go up to the Arctic during the summer when it wasn't quite so cold, and they would just hang out on the islands up there and catch great auks, hunt them, send the feathers back, get lots of money. They would eat the meat, and then they would come back once it got too cold for them. The problem with that is that the great auk started to disappear. And by the mid-1800s, maybe the 1840s, there were no great auks left. And so now we don't have anything really like penguins in our northern hemisphere. The closest thing we have are puffins, which can fly, and they can also swim, but they're not nearly as much like penguins as the great auk was. All right, our next animal that we're going to talk about is one of these behind me. So I'm going to, this zoomed in just a little bit so you can't see him, but right here. So this is the Arctic fox, and it's adorable. It's one of my favorite kinds of foxes. I like pretty much all foxes, but these ones are very cute. And they are one of the few animals that actually go all the way to the North Pole. Scientists, researchers who make visits and expeditions to the Arctic have actually found these guys' little paw prints in the snow up in the Arctic. And actually, speaking of their feet, that is one of their most interesting features. Let's see if... All right, I can't turn the camera around, but I can bring you a little closer to show you his tiny little feet. And if you look at him, you'll see that they're very, very furry. You can barely even see the paw pads on the back of his foot. And that's because it's really cold up there in the snow, and he needs something to protect his feet. And those furry feet are what give him his scientific name, which is Volpe's Legopus. And it's one of my favorite scientific names of all time because I just think it's really cute. Legopus, if you take that apart, the word Lego comes from the word that means hair. And not the hair as in like his hairy feet, but hair as in like rabbits. And that's because rabbits also have hairy feet. So Lego is hair and puss is foot. So he's a hare-footed fox, basically. Fox with rabbit feet. And then we can also come back to that fur. So the fur is one of the things that helps the Arctic fox survive way up there in the cold. He has very, very thick fur. His tail is thick and bushy, and all of that nice covering on his body helps him to survive in temperatures as low as negative 58 degrees. Really, really cold, and not something I would want to be in. I have right here, this is an Arctic fox pelt, so you can kind of see the texture of that fur. There's a hole in it, my finger just went through. But if you like bend that to try to get to the skin, it's pretty much impossible to find the skin underneath all of that dense fur. He has longer guard hairs on the top, and then underneath he has this really, really soft and thick, fluffy fur that protects his skin from the wind and the cold. So when he's up there in the snow, the Arctic fox wants to be as warm as he can be, and he wants to blend in with the snow because there are predators like polar bears that might come after him. I think I've got just a little out of the screen there, but there's a polar bear right here behind me. And he wants to be able to blend in with that white ice and snow so that he can be safe. But when the ice starts to melt and he comes down a little farther south to have a lot more access to the food, he's in places where it wouldn't be so advantageous to be white. So Arctic foxes actually shed their winter coat and change color. So you can see this one has this sort of brownish, he's getting brown. This is actually probably a springtime or a fall coat, because by the time summer is really in swing and they're down in the Arctic tundra where there's plants covering the ground, they'll be almost completely brown, kind of a grayish brown color. But if you look at these two next to each other, you can see there's quite a difference in color. We have the really winter one, and then he's starting to turn brown here. But it's still nice and warm and thick. You can see you can't get to that skin at all through this really dense fur. So when they do come down to the Arctic, sometimes they'll even eat vegetables down there. They're omnivorous. They're not strictly carnivores. So the Arctic fox will hunt small rodents and small mammals. He'll catch birds, and he'll catch fish if he can, and he'll also eat those vegetables. But when it starts to get cold again and the ice is coming back and he's wandering far and wide looking for that food, he has to be kind of creative. And so sometimes he'll hang around with these polar bears. I'm gonna try to get both of them in there. There we go. He'll hang around with the polar bears and wait for them to pull seals up out of the ice. And once the polar bear is done eating, the Arctic foxes will come in behind and take up the scraps, and they'll get what they can during those harsh winters. All right, so we've talked about a couple animals. We talked about the great auk and the Arctic fox. Now we're going to talk about some plants. Because even though it's all ice and snow and farther down in the Arctic tundra where there's land, it's still really cold. There are still plants that are able to survive up there. So some of the biggest ones that live up there, most of them, are lichens and mosses. And I wasn't able to find a lichen mount today, so I don't have anything to show you for those. But they're really small plants. They are very close to the ground, and a lot of times up in the Arctic, they'll grow underneath rocks, because when you're nice and wedged in there, you can be away from the wind and the snow, and it's a lot easier to stay warm. But lichens and mosses, they're not the only plants that grow up in the Arctic. We actually have a few other ones. So this one right here is a really cool little plant called an Arctic crocus. And it's a great example of an Arctic plant because it shows some of the really common characteristics that plants up in the Arctic tundra will have. You can see these flowers are a really dark purple color, and the leaves as well hidden underneath all that hair, which we'll get to in a second, are a kind of a darker grayish color. So all of those dark colors work to help attract the sunlight. If you've ever been outside in the summertime, maybe like in a soccer game, if you had a really dark uniform, you might have noticed that the sun just heated up your clothes really, really hot. But if you're wearing something light colored, the sun kind of bounces off of it and it doesn't absorb so much heat. So having these dark colors for a plant up in the Arctic is really, really helpful because they're able to soak in all of that extra heat, and it makes it easier for them to do photosynthesis. They're able to make their food and attract extra sunlight and stay warm so they don't just freeze. That's actually kind of similar. We aren't really going to talk a lot about the polar bear today, but it's kind of similar to how the polar bear stays warm. He has this white fur on the top, but underneath, and you can tell even by looking at his nose and his lips, he has black skin. So having those dark colors really helps to attract the sunlight and warm you up when you're living somewhere really cold, which is great for these little Arctic plants. Another thing, like we mentioned just a minute ago, is all of that hair that you see on the Arctic crocus. So the really thick hair helps protect the plant's surface from the wind, and it also helps to trap in heat. So it's kind of like how our hair works. We have these hairs all over our arms that don't do too much, but you'll notice when you're cold, that hair lifts up just a little bit, and it creates this tiny little surface over your skin that traps in warm air, so that cold air doesn't affect you quite so much. And all this hair on the plant can work the same way. It can just trap in a nice little layer of warm air. Another way that they trap in that warm air is by growing really close to the ground. So most plants that you'll see in the Arctic tundra don't get very tall, because if they were super tall, all that wind would just blow around them and make them really cold. But by growing close to the ground, they can stay nice and warm in that nice little layer of warm air that's trapped near the surface of the earth, close to the ground. All right, our next animal and our last one that we're going to talk about today is actually not just at the North Pole. It's the only animal that can be found both at the North Pole and at the South Pole. And I shouldn't have put this down because it is the humpback whale, and I definitely don't have one with me because it's gigantic. Here's a picture of a humpback whale and a little baby humpback whale. And I also have a picture of where they live. So you'll see this little map here is broken up into places where they spend most of their time, and you can see they live up here, these dark blue areas near the North Pole in the Arctic. They live down at the South Pole in the Antarctic, and then they also can hang out near the equator. So the cool thing about humpback whales is that they'll migrate during the year. They'll start up at one of the poles, either the North Pole or the South Pole, and that's where they get a lot of their food. And then when it starts to get too cold for them up there, they'll come down to the coastal waters near the equator. They like to hang out kind of near Central America and Australia. And there, they'll raise their babies, and once their babies are big enough, they go back up to the North Pole or down to the South Pole, and they go hunting again. The interesting thing is that while they're there breeding, they actually don't eat. They like to get their food up in those colder waters. And the way they do it is by using baleen. Whoops. So I've got this really, really big. I want to see if I can show you how big it is all at once. There we go. So this is a piece of whale baleen. And if you look at it really closely, you'll see it looks kind of hairy. And that's because it's made of keratin. Just like our hair and our fingernails, whale baleen is made of keratin. And over time, here I'll show you how it's situated in its mouth real quick. There we go. So they've got lots and lots of plates of baleen here, kind of lined up in their mouth. This is the side of a humpback whale's mouth. And all of that baleen is stuck in there. And over time on the inside, it starts to fray. And you can see all of these little frayed edges. And that's what allows them to trap their food. So they'll have rows and rows of baleen in their mouth. They'll open their mouth really big, taking a big mouthful of water. And when when they have that water in their mouth, it's full of lots of little creatures that they might want to eat. Humpback whales' favorite food is krill and small fish. They like to eat really small fish. So they'll take all that water in, and then they close their mouth and spit the water through the baleen filter. I'll show you the picture so you can kind of imagine. So that water comes right out of their mouth and through the baleen. The water goes out, but the krill and the small fish get trapped in all of these little hairy bits on the inside of their mouth. And then the whale uses its super huge tongue to just lick the inside of the baleen and get all of those little animals out. And that's what it eats, a lot at a time. All right, so that is all that we had today for Arctic plants and animals. If you guys are left with any questions, you can leave me a comment down below, and I hope to see you next week. Have a great week. Bye.